Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're talking about the 2026 U.S. Georgia Senate race, and we're talking about the primary that will be taking place on May 19th, which is a very competitive primary on the Republican side to see who gets to run against the Democratic U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff. So there's a lot to break down in this video. I'm going to go over the candidates in the Republican primary, where things currently stand in this race, and how things currently look for the general election and some key areas to watch for in the state of Georgia. So first things first, there are overall a total of 5 Republican candidates that are running in the Georgia U.S. Senate Republican primary. The 3 most notable candidates and the 3 that are most likely to win are U.S. Representative Mike Collins, U.S. Representative Buddy Carter, and outsider candidate Derek Dooley. Now, these are very interesting candidates at the time. I don't believe President Trump has officially made an endorsement in this race as of the time I am recording this video, but Mike Collins and Buddy Carter are 2 Republicans that are, I would say, Trump-aligned candidates, but have not been endorsed by him. Derek Dooley is the former coach of the University of Tennessee's football team. He has been endorsed by the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, who he in his own right is term limited and cannot seek another term in Georgia. He was at one time considering a run for the U.S. Senate seat in Georgia, but Dooley officially has Kemp's endorsement. And what makes this race very interesting is for a while now, this race has looked like it's been Mike Collins to lose. I'm going to show you very quickly the early voting. There's been requests. There's roughly been about 17,891 ballots requested. For ballots returned, 11,341. Early voting's been 340,256 votes thus far. So clearly a lot of early optimism in the early voting in the state of Georgia, including some very strong numbers from Fulton County. This is where the city of Atlanta is, 20,000 votes coming from there, and 23,000 coming from Cobb County as well. So big population areas. As for this primary, first we'll start with the polling. The polling has shown a race that's within reach of the other candidates, but one that Mike Collins has led by a pretty consistent amount. Now, even you can go back to, say, October of 2025, Collins led over Buddy Carter 30-20, and Derek Dooley in this polling average had roughly about 12%. Now, Collins has continued to lead in this race over time, but what's interesting is in the final few weeks or so, it actually shows Buddy Carter's support has slightly gone down from 15.6 down to roughly about 14.6, but Derek Dooley's support has gone up. He was around 11.1% in March. Now he's gone up to roughly about 14.4. Now, in past videos for primaries like the Texas U.S. Senate primary, the Illinois Senate primary that I've covered on the channel, I mentioned that primaries are interesting because they can kind of be unpredictable, especially in a field where there's 2 or 3 main candidates that are running. They're a little bit hard to predict, and they can be a little bit sort of tough to gauge. Now, on this one, Mike Collins is leading 29.2%, and Buddy Carter and Derek Dooley are essentially tied for 3rd place. Now, I do believe I want to fact check this 100% to be correct here. So, if no candidate breaks 50% of the vote, it looks like there would be a runoff in this Republican primary. And it's possible Mike Collins, if he's the winning Republican candidate, can break 50% outright. But it's going to be interesting because even though Derek Dooley is clearly and Buddy Carter are clearly trailing Mike Collins in the polling average, Derek Dooley's support is starting to go up at very least a little bit. It also is worth noting he has the endorsement of Brian Kemp, who is shown to be very strong in the state of Georgia electorally. So it's going to be something very significant. And the prediction odds on the betting markets show something similar. The Kalshi odds for this race have shown a very, very different surge in the last few weeks. Let me explain. First things first, start back in December of 2024. Brian Kemp is the clear leader in this race. He says he's not going to run. Mike Collins takes the lead. And really throughout most of 2025 and the beginning parts of 2026, Mike Collins has held a very solid lead, and there hasn't really been too much to it. Until roughly about May 7th, where things really start to shift. Mike Collins is at 87%. Derek Dooley is at 7%. And I'm going to go to the last month or so just to give you an idea of how this looks more close up. Even the next week I'll go closer as well. But look at the line here. Collins goes from 83% chance to favored all the way down to roughly Derek Dooley going all the way up here. And now Derek Dooley took a little bit of a lead in this race the last day or two, where it's essentially a 50-50 race between Derek Dooley and Mike Collins. With even the current point in time, overall, looking at this, with Derek Dooley ahead 51-49. So clearly there's something that the Calshi people who are betting here, they are betting that they think which candidate's going to win. There's something the polls have not currently reflected in this race that shows Derek Dooley leading over Mike Collins. So it's going to be very interesting because Derek Dooley obviously has the endorsement of Brian Kemp. As I mentioned, President Trump at this current point in time has stayed out of this race. This could all play a very important role if Trump in the next few days makes an endorsement for Mike Collins or Buddy Carter, or even doubles down on Derek Dooley. It can certainly shake things up in this race. If he decides to stay out of it, it's shaping up to be a very close race between Collins and Dooley, but one the polling does not necessarily reflect. So it's going to be a question of, well, who do you believe more? Do you believe the polls, which shows Collins leading by a lot, or the Calshi odds would show a very tightening race between Dooley and Collins, where they may see something on the ground in the early voting numbers or in the voter registration numbers that show Derek Dooley maybe off to a lead here. So it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see how it all shakes out. Just to give you an idea of some of the other polling averages, they're all pretty consistent on this. The most recent poll from Quantus Insight, which is a Republican pollster, showed Mike Collins at 33%. Derek Dooley was up to 23%, so he's clearly surging in the polls a little bit. Buddy Carter's at 14%, and 27% were still undecided. So it looks like at this current point in time, there's more than enough undecided vote left out there for both Mike Collins and Derek Dooley to get a lot of that vote and maybe even be the first place candidate. Is there enough for one of them to break 50% and win outright without a runoff being needed? That's going to be a little bit of a wait and see. But it's very interesting. It seems like Mike Collins is the favorite, but the Calshi odds shifting so drastically towards Derek Dooley, to me at least, sets off a little bit of an alarm bell that there might be something happening on the ground in Georgia in terms of early voting that maybe we're not necessarily caught up to nationally from the polling data. So right now I'd say Mike Collins is the favorite, but Derek Dooley certainly surging is very significant. Now what this all means is to advance to the general election to face off against the Democrat U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff. Now, Ossoff, for his own right, on the Democratic side, does not obviously have a competitive primary. He's the U.S. Senator. He'll be the nominee once again. Now, just to give you a brief little overview, he won his Senate race in 2020 in the special circumstances surrounding that election with the runoff election after the 2020 election, everything President Trump was saying about the 2020 election, and despite doing a rally in Georgia, even saying that some Republicans, if they're angry, they shouldn't get out and vote. Obviously kind of revisionist history, trying to sum it all up quickly, but essentially that's what was going on. And a lot of Republicans did ultimately stay home from the 2020 election and the runoff, which was separated by about like a month or 2 months or something. And David Perdue on the initial ballot actually defeated Jon Ossoff, getting 49.73% or 49.73%. Ossoff got 47.95%. But like I mentioned earlier with Georgia election law, you must break 50% of the vote to win. If you don't break 50%, it goes to a 1v1 runoff election where the winning candidate automatically will break 50%. So that ended up happening. It went to a runoff, and more of Jon Ossoff's voters that voted for him in November returned to vote out again in the runoff. David Perdue's supporters, like 200,000 of them stayed home or something like that. Jon Ossoff ends up winning 1.2% in a very close election. So this Senate race that was 1.2% in 2021 became automatically a top target for the Republicans in 2026. Now, thus far in the polling, polling and prediction odds here, it's looking more and more likely that Jon Ossoff has a lead in this race and has a pretty significant one. On Decision Desk HQ, what they have for Ossoff versus Buddy Carter, the most recent poll from Echelon Insights, they have is Ossoff at 52, Carter at 43, a solid lead for the Democrat there. For the Emerson poll from back in February 28th to March 2nd, Ossoff's at 47.7, Mike Collins at 43.3, a closer race, one that Republicans would feel more better about, but still one that Ossoff is leading. In terms of the political prediction market size, Calshi is very confident at 83 to 18, which I believe using the rankings would be a likely Democrat ranking. I have to pull that chart up, but I do believe this is a very strong in favor for the Democrats. So what does this all mean for Georgia? Well, we can look at the state of Georgia, which at the presidential level has been very close 2 elections in a row now. The presidential race, voting for Joe Biden over Donald Trump by about 0.2%. Can show that in 2020. It voted for Biden by 0.24. Trump won it in 2024 by 2.2. So it's perennially now a very close state, one of the closest states in all the United States, right up there with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania as some of the top toss-up states. What does it mean for 2026? Well, the key areas to watch for, we can look, this is the Senate race in 2022, but even the presidential race in 2024, the greater Atlanta area has seen a ton of population growth over the last 20 years or so. So you're talking about Fulton County, Douglas County, Cobb County, Gwinnett County, and the surrounding counties that are smaller in population compared to those but still pretty big, like Henry, like Rockdale, like DeKalb County, like you can go up here to some of these Republican areas surrounding as well. This is the key area. Now, from 2020 to 2024, Donald Trump did better in some of these areas. DeKalb County, he did better by 2.6%. He did better in Gwinnett by 1.74%. Did better in Fulton by 1.54%. But these shifts aren't really drastic when you compare. Pretty much the entire country went more Republican in 2024 than it was in 2020. And I'm going to illustrate this here for you. I'm going to compare the 2024 map statewide to the 2020 map. Pretty much every single state and every single congressional district on the map overall, we're talking about Maine and Nebraska specifically, shifted to the Republican side. The only two that didn't both came from Nebraska, where the 3rd district went a little bit more towards Trump by about under 1 point, and the 2nd district went towards Kamala Harris, or the 1st district went towards Harris by roughly about 1.9. But everywhere else in the country went towards Trump, including Georgia, which shifted about 2.4%. But when you look at some of the shifts in some of the states around the United States, 2.4% isn't a ton when you consider, like, Virginia shifted 4.3, Ohio went 3.2, Nevada went 5.5, Arizona 5.8, Texas 8.1, Florida 9.7. So Georgia's 2.4% shift was sort of a modest one for a 2024 presidential year where the Republicans won pretty much in everywhere. So for what to watch for 2026, you have a Democratic incumbent in Jon Ossoff, who is up in an election that's going to be a very good night for the Democrats based on all the polling. And I can actually show what the current generic ballot numbers are. The Democrats are currently at 46%. Republicans are currently at 39.7%. So the Democrats actually are kind of breaking up one of their larger leads over this cycle since this poll has been tracked now. They're starting to grow a little bit of a larger lead in this one. We could also look at the president's approval ratings as well and give a quick look at how that's currently looking in terms of why this may be happening. President Trump's current approval rating here will go towards this one. The website's my cursor is being a little slow, but 40.3 for Trump of approve, 57.4 for disapprove, roughly overall about negative 17 points for Trump. So you have a Democratic senator up in a swing state, an incumbent who Jon Ossoff for his own right, you're going to see here when we get to the general election part for the polling, but also I want to see they have the money financials parts as well. Yes, for fundraising, he has raised over 77.9, nearly $78 million as of March 31st. So he's clearly taking this re-election campaign very seriously. He's already spent $50 million of it. He has $31.7 million cash on hand. Jon Ossoff and the Ossoff campaign are very, very taking this race seriously, and they're up for the tough fight. And it's going to be tough for Republicans like Buddy Carter, Mike Collins, and Derek Dooley, who are in a very tough political primary fight, who are having to use a lot of their resources to go after each other to then go to a general election and take on a Democratic incumbent who is dwarfing them in terms of how much money he has. That's good for fundraising, for general election like TV ads, for social media ads, for voter canvassing, going door to door, phone calls, phone banks, all the fun stuff that nobody wants to do for the elections, but are the hard grunt work that helps candidates win. All that stuff, the Ossoff campaign has a massive advantage on that front. You see your Buddy Carter has roughly raised about 6.7 million, Mike Collins 4.3, Derek Dooley 3.6. So it's actually evened up a little bit in this the campaign finance report since it has for the past 6 months or so. But the Democrats have a lot more for their general election than the Republicans do. We could also look very briefly before we move on to the general about the 2022 U.S. Senate race where Herschel Walker versus Raphael Warnock, the Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock, who won in 2021's runoff with Jon Ossoff. He won in the first ballot 49.4 to 48.49 over Walker. Similar circumstances, didn't break 50%, goes to the runoff. He wins 51.4 to 48.6. Again, this was in a Republican midterm year of 2022, which the Democrats did better than expected due to the Roe v. Wade being overturned. But still, Republicans had a decent night in a lot of areas of the country, but Georgia held strong for the Democratic incumbent against Herschel Walker. And I think we're going to see something at the bare minimum similar to this, but more so in the Democratic favor when everything is said and done. So looking for the general election now, it's going to depend which candidate obviously it is, but as for the rankings, Inside Elections does have it as a toss-up, but Cook Political Report, Sabler's Crystal Ball, and Race to the White House all have it favored for Ossoff, the Democrat, either lean Democrat or likely Democrat, and I think it's very significant why. You look at the polling data thus far, and Ossoff's lead is off to a lean Democratic amount versus Buddy Carter. He's up about 4.7%, which using the rankings that I do from the JJ election map, which is 5 to 1 is considered lean, and then 1 under being tilt. Ossoff's leading by roughly about a lean margin in that polling average. And it's not like there hasn't been no polls here. There's actually been a pretty decent amount of polls for a Senate race in Georgia this early on, including an Emerson poll from February to March, showing Ossoff leading over Carter by roughly about 3 points. As for Ossoff versus Mike Collins, which up until recently has been the most likely matchup, it's also a 4.3% lead across the averages for Jon Ossoff over Mike Collins. In that same Emerson poll, it was roughly about a 5-point lead for Ossoff versus Collins. So that one even looks like more of a potential blowout based on the Emerson poll, but the average of them overall still would have Ossoff leading by about 4.3. What's interesting here is also the Derek Dooley versus Jon Ossoff one, is there's been less polls in this one, but that Emerson poll showed Ossoff at 49%, so Ossoff gets his highest share of the support in the Emerson poll against Derek Dooley, and the Republican Dooley only gets 41%. That's the lowest share of support in that poll. So it'll be interesting to see if Dooley does pull off the upset in the Republican primary. Does his support still stay low at 41%? Or being the Republican nominee, will it consolidate a bit? And what do those 10% that are undecided ultimately do? But what you're seeing here is the Democratic incumbent where he's starting out 46.7%, 47.3%, and 47%. The Republicans are down at 42.3%, 43%, and roughly about 39.9% for Dooley. You can just look at the math and you can look at past elections here. We know that when everything is said and done, the Republicans are going to get more than 43% of the vote, and we know the Democrats in Georgia, unless the Republicans find a way to win, are going to get more than 47%. But the question is going to be, once you add those up, say 47 plus 43, you're at 90% of the vote. What are the remaining 10% of the vote do? Those 10% that are undecided or voting third party or haven't made up their minds or have made up their minds and just aren't telling the pollsters who are they supporting. In a swing state like Georgia, that's going to be very crucial. And when you look at the race, you look at the incumbent obviously has the advantage that he has the fundraising advantage over the challenger. He has more money. He likely has more name recognition, which is very significant in elections as well. And what's the overall national environment? National environments play a very big role. When everything is breaking for one party, that can have a massive effect in several states. It can make safe states more competitive. It can make pretty reliable states very close to being competitive, and it can make battleground states be flips or holds for the party that's not usually in charge of the state. So for Jon Ossoff in a state like Georgia, he is the Democratic incumbent of a swing state, one that Republicans would love to win, but given the election environment, which based on right now, the approval ratings of President Trump and the Republicans and the Democrats nationwide, at very least, at the bare amount, you would have to say Jon Ossoff is narrowly favored in this race starting out in the lean Democratic category, and depending on how the next few months goes, it may even go above into likely Democrat, which is that 5 to 15 point margin there. We're not going to see Georgia go by more than 15 points for the Democrat over the Republican. It's way too competitive of a state. That's not even in the realm of possibility. But is Georgia voting Democratic in a runoff by more than 5 points possible? Absolutely it is. An election trend for 2020 to 2024 and even 2016 to 2024 shows the growth in the Atlanta area is possible for that. Plus the midterm election environment of 2026 being a big night for the Democrats. Could Ossoff win by 5 points because of that alone? Yes, he could. But for this video, we're focusing on the Republican primary, but whichever Republican advances is going to have to go up against a Democratic incumbent who has a lot more money than they do, who probably has a lot more name ID than they do. It's going to be a very interesting race for the general election. One, I think the Democrats are favored starting out, but going to be watching this one very, very carefully as Georgia plays a very important role on the 2026 U.S. Senate map. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, make sure to hit like. Also, make sure to hit subscribe and stay tuned as I post a new video every single day about some of the most interesting topics going on in U.S. elections as of the news breaks. So make sure to keep an eye out for all of those. For now, thank you so much for watching. Again, please remember to hit like and subscribe, and hope to see you in a future video.